Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll try and start. We've advertised this session as a panel session. We've got some brief presentations to introduce the topic, and we've got a very well-informed group of people to talk about it. My name's John Matthews from Melbourne. We'll hear also from Louisa Jorm from Sydney. So Australia is represented. We've got Leanne Parkin, who many of you will know from New Zealand, Graham Osmond from the New Zealand government, and Paul Madden from the Commonwealth of Australia, Department of Health, has sent a video which we'll see towards the end, and Frank Sullivan from Dundee, who's already captured everyone's imagination about linkage, will also be part of the panel. So I thought I would start just very briefly with a noddy's guide, if you like, for those of you who haven't been to the linkage sessions before. Thank you. We're basically going to try and address some of the key issues about the interface between linkage, privacy and public benefit. Good. Okay. And you all know we bring together information from different record collections, linking them by a common anonymised identifier. And most often we're interested in linking different health records for individuals. But because of the use of personal identifiers, the privacy issues have been of great concern in many quarters, and many data linkage projects have not been approved by the responsible authorities and data custodians, or they've been deferred for so long that the researchers have often felt like giving up. And there's been a great loss in terms of public benefit. And it's ironic in a way that Australia, which played a very important lead role in the early years in Western Australia in particular, with the record linkage there, has now fallen behind in recent years in terms of international comparisons. So why do we want to do record linkage? Well, we can answer questions that are very difficult to answer in other ways. Detecting rare side effects. I'll talk a little bit about deep venous thrombosis after air travel, the risks of cancer following CT scans in childhood, the risks of birth defect after maternal medication. And the public would normally expect that all available data would be routinely used to detect such risks. But unfortunately, in Australia in recent years and in many other countries, this hasn't happened. And why has the record linkage been languishing in Australia? Well, public benefit has suffered primarily because of the continuing concerns about some fundamental issues. Firstly, the use of data for purposes that were not originally intended, and that's often government data, but not exclusively so. The potential for invasion of privacy if personal data are made available for research purposes. And of course, the subsidiary concern is that even de-identified data may be re-identifiable if multiple data items are released. And of course, governments and others have been concerned about the additional costs of doing record linkage. And one of the things that's often been in the background and not very easy to talk about is the potential for research findings to reflect adversely on the performance of government or other data custodians. Someone like me at the end of their career can say that. It's more difficult for younger researchers. In epidemiology, we often need to relate exposures with outcomes. Long-haul air travel and hospital admission for DVT, radiation from CT scans and cancer incidence, 2 studies I've been associated with. It was known that passengers on long-haul airline flights were at increased risk of DVT and pulmonary embolism. However, it was not known how long the increased risks lasted after the flight. And in 2003, when I was in Canberra, we worked with Chris Kelman and others and Darcy Holman in Western Australia to link hospital records of DVT admissions in Western Australia to Commonwealth records of passenger arrivals on long-haul air flights to answer that question. And the short answer was the increase in risk was greatest in the first week after arrival, incident rate ratio of 5.6, and it fell in the second week, and by 3 weeks or later the risk had virtually disappeared. Radiation and cancer risk. We've known for a long time from the Japanese study that increases in leukemia and cancer follow ionising radiation. But today in many countries there's more exposure to low-dose radiation from diagnostic medical X-rays, particularly computed tomography CT scans, than from other sources. And it's important to understand whether CT scans and other medical X-rays are also causing cancers in later years. So we did a very large study looking at 680,000 young Australians who were CT exposed using Medicare records, and over 10 million who were non-exposed, and we maximised the exposure at early ages. It was a cohort, the largest cohort ever done, and we confirmed what the British study had shown earlier, increases in brain cancer and leukemia. But because our study was larger, we also found increases of all cancers, not just brain cancer and leukemia, and this shows the dose response. So, and there are issues about reverse causation I could talk about, but that shows the power of record linkage. I'll just comment very briefly on the fact that it took about 5 years from the time we started talking to government about releasing the data before we could actually get the data and do the study. And again, it's one of the advantages of being old. You've got more time to put into things. Okay. So, ways ahead, very simple-minded things. We need to ensure that we legislate to allow data to be used for research purposes when this has not already been done. We need to be able to ensure that there's a way of getting linkage keys established in secure facilities where sensitive data are not accessible. For instance, in our CT study, the Medicare identifiers and the Medicare data came to us with an anonymous number. The cancer incidence data came to us with another anonymous number. So nobody in the study had access to data that they wouldn't normally, identifiable data that they would normally have access to. And there are many ways of doing the same thing that we've heard about from Frank and other people. Making linked data available in de-identified form to the end users, and not unnecessarily restricting the number of data items provided to researchers. In several other studies, we've had interminable delays while we tried to persuade data custodians to release more data items. The concern is re-identification, but we need to deal with that in another way. We just create legal penalties for researchers or other third parties who use multiple data items to re-identify individuals. And a lot of these things are happening at the moment. We've all lived through, and a number of epidemiologists are still living through, the throes of trying to get studies up in Australia. The Commonwealth, up until very recently, has been very reluctant to use data linkage with national data, and a number of people in the room here have worked very hard to change that. So we'll explore these issues and the successes that have already appeared in many countries as the panel goes on. And if anyone is interested, the two studies I referred to are both published in the BMJ. There's also a very useful discussion paper on the website of the Menzies Foundation in Melbourne with a lot of background material from a recent workshop we held there in August 2013. It's now my pleasure to welcome Louisa Jorm from Sydney, who will also give some examples around the record linkage environment in Australia. Louisa.
I'm actually doing something slightly different, which I think is focusing on one of the other aims of this session, which was really to talk about the future of big data and epidemiologic research, which will have one small sort of presentation of research results, but that's not really the focus. So I just want to talk about three things. I think we have a mindset of that we're actually protecting people in some way, but I think we actually need to question whether or not participants want to be protected, or whether in fact they want to be empowered to sort of control their own information in ways that we haven't really given them the opportunity to in the past. I think this, John's already mentioned this idea of sort of blindfolding researchers by restricting what they can have. Is that really the way of the future when we're going to be flooded by huge amounts of data? I've got the picture of that sort of water coming out of the dam and just engulfing us. It's going to become increasingly difficult to work out even technical ways of trying to blindfold researchers and to sort of prevent disclosure through those sorts of methods. And then finally, I think as epidemiologists, we have to somehow reconcile these approaches of testing hypotheses versus mining associations. And maybe not quite as old as you, John, but I've been around for quite a while, and I don't think data mining or data dredging, we have not really integrated those sort of techniques, and most epidemiologists don't necessarily understand them. Somehow we're going to have to come to terms with these two different sort of approaches to research. So these are my three things. So firstly, the protecting participants. I really love this quotation from Carol Bennett, who was the immediate past CEO of the Consumers Health Forum of Australia. So this is the peak body for health consumers in Australia. She published this article in the Australian Financial Review last year, basically representing the voice of Australian health consumers and making a very strong case that it's actually really time that the linkage of Medicare data, which is MBS and PBS data in Australia, happens. And I like her words, it seems absurd to continue stumbling in the dark in a room already wired for lights, which is exactly right. We've got a Medicare number. There are all sorts of arguments about what it can and can't be used for, but most of them are not actually based on any real basis in legislation. The issue is more there's uncertainty and lack of clarity about what can be done, rather than things being explicitly prohibited currently. But anyway, if this is what the consumers have wanted, who exactly are we protecting by some of the current sort of very protective policies of the Australian government? But here's my only bit of data. You won't find very many studies at all that actually have used both MBS, which is medical claims data, and PBS, pharmaceutical claims data in Australia. This is not a particularly exciting bit of research, but it's one example, one I'm familiar with, and in fact Jim Warren from the University of Auckland is the first author of this paper, so some of you may know Jim. So this was using the 45 and up study. I won't give the details details of the methods, but basically we were looking at continuity of GP care and whether or not people are adherent to statin therapy. And we had about 36,000 people in the 45 and up study who'd actually had a statin dispense, as Jim, who's an American, describes it, within 90 days of entering the study. And about 60% of those participants saw the same GP 75% or more of the time, and about 80% of them were adherent to statins as defined in this study. And we did find that the upper tertile of the usual provider index, which is that measure of continuity of care, was associated with a significant increase in their likelihood of being adherent to statins. A sort of stratified analysis here looking at age, remoteness of residence, gender, and new to statin status. I guess the most exciting thing there was that this effect of continuity of care, or this association between continuity of care and adherence, was particularly strong for people who were new to statins, who did not have history in the past 5 years of previous statin dispense. The effect of continuity of care was weaker at older ages, and that sort of makes sense. These people have been on statins for a long time. They're sort of already adherent to statins. And slight but weak possibility the effect of continuity of care was stronger in the major cities than in the rural areas. Anyway, I had to present some data. But I think all of us know that everybody out there is sharing all sorts of things. I was a bit saddened to see that New Zealand appears to be absent from from this world map, and I thought of adding something on, but I didn't. There is a little thing down there, isn't there? Yes. But, we're sharing our opinions on all sorts of things, of movies on Rotten Tomatoes, of restaurants and hotels on TripAdvisor. Some of it is happening without our knowledge. Celebrities' nude photos are being uploaded onto the cloud, obviously without them knowing about it. But a lot of it is happening with the very active participation of individuals. And I think there are quite a number of current initiatives that are around trying to sort of empower people to manage and control their own data. And we're going to have to work with these new things. Frank earlier in his talk today actually talked about an initiative in Scotland which I think was called Share, is that right? Where people basically sort of volunteer themselves to be included as participants in future studies or to be invited to participate. They actively put themselves forward. They allow their data, the linked data that are held in Scotland, to be used to identify them as possible participants with a particular health condition who can then be contacted. But there are other sorts of initiatives like this one, which is called MyDex, which is sort of a personally controlled repository of data about individuals. There have in the past been various things like, I think, Google Health and so on, which actually didn't, maybe they were just before their time, they didn't really take off. But I think some of these other possibly less profit-oriented sorts of initiatives now, people are going to take control of their own data. We may be able to get them to share it with us. In fact, we may be able to completely bypass the traditional data custodians altogether. So I think it's possibly time the traditional data custodians sort of changed their attitude a bit and actually thought about providing opportunities for people to volunteer themselves to share, if that's what they want to do, rather than this idea that we are protecting them from the research and all the privacy risks that go with it. The second thing was blindfolding researchers or trusting them. And I think this statistical disclosure control, it's a science, but I think in many ways we put far too much effort into this area of trying to sort of obfuscate the data that we give to people. No matter how you look at it, most of these techniques actually do reduce the research utility of the data. So you can suppress the records in small geographic areas, you can remove variables, as John talked about, you can sort of reduce the number of response categories within variables, you can aggregate small areas into larger ones, you can perturb the data. You can do all of these things. All of them actually do come at a cost to research. But I think from the data custodian point of view, they also come at a huge cost in terms of the amount of work that it takes to actually do these things to the data. It's a non-trivial task to do these things to the data. It's not an automated task. The larger the data get in terms of the number of variables and the number of records, the greater the potential disclosure risks. And it's really going to become a very, very large job indeed to apply these sorts of techniques to the data that we've got. So perhaps there's other things we need to be focusing on, particularly in terms of why don't we trust researchers and why don't we provide them with some tools that will help us to trust them. This is one of my favourite slides, a World War II facility, part of the Manhattan Project. But this is really, I guess, the concept of the safe haven that has already been mentioned by several speakers. We in Australia already have a safe haven that has been funded by the Commonwealth Government called SURE at the Sachs Institute. It stands for the Secure Unified Research Environment. Basically, it's just a whole lot of computers and wires. It's in a extremely secure data centre, and it provides remote access to linked data for approved research. I guess there's two really important things about it. One is the thing called the curated gateway, which is the mechanism by which data come in and outputs go out. And also the fact that each individual study is sort of partitioned within its own security bubble, which allows no transfer of data between those studies. In terms of the gateway, I think this is a little bit unique. I don't think there are many other systems like this in countries around the world. But the Curated Gateway was a bespoke piece of software that was written for this that actually does allow a huge amount of flexibility in terms of the permissions and rules that can be built in. Who's allowed to do what can be controlled to a very fine-grained level, as well as a complete audit trail of everything that goes in and out being kept. And in particular, for example, if a particular data custodian wants to have the opportunity to look at every output before it goes out, that can be built in. If that's not what they want, that doesn't need to be built in. So in many ways it provides a sort of a software tool for the sort of proportionate governance idea that Frank mentioned. Different studies may require different levels of control. This software gives you that sort of ability to tailor what you do. The other side of this, I think, is the idea of accrediting researchers or having trusted researchers. And again, in Australia, we haven't really gone down that pathway. We just assume all researchers are probably fairly incompetent and bumbling or possibly even malign in what they may want to do with the data. But in fact, that's patently not true. But perhaps we need some rather more formal mechanisms for actually accrediting researchers. And I think in particular we do need much better formal training in some of the areas that are relevant to big data and in particular to data security, protecting privacy. And there's a lot to be done here. There's a few safe researcher type courses available in Australia. I don't know what's available in New Zealand. But I think, for example, here, the Population Data BC in Canada, they're now actually sort of developing specific formal qualifications in population health data analysis. I think we need some more of this training. Maybe it's something Australians and New Zealanders can work together on. Then the final area, the sort of testing hypotheses versus mining associations. This sort of diagram of a duck, I think, is the usual or the more traditional epidemiological approach, that we feel we have to have a very good understanding of the causal pathway, of what the confounding variables might be, what the interactions are. We really have to have a nice sort of causal diagram mapped out before we go just playing with our data. But down in the bottom corner there, you've got the typical output of a GWAS study, a genome-wide association study. No hypotheses whatsoever. Let's just see what associations are there. How are we going to sort of reconcile these approaches? I don't have an answer, but I found some quite amusing diagrams about this. It originally said social science, by the way, not epidemiology. I just replaced that with epidemiology, and it seemed to fit quite nicely. Amusingly enough, there are a number of danger zones there. And I think we have this idea of epi-unaware data science. A lot of that is happening. I was recently involved in putting together a grant application with geneticists, and I could hardly speak the same language as them, but they had a lot of data science that I didn't understand, and I think I would describe that as being epi-unaware data science. I think this is where the traditional epidemiologist sits with his tools. He knows he has to understand the domain to some extent, statistics, epidemiology. We feel quite comfortable in that particular intersection. But I think this is where we need to be moving. This is the sort of future-oriented epidemiologist. He's not necessarily young, but he's a little bit hipster, he's a bit green, and he's got new tools that are in fact quite sharp that he can use to sort of winnow his way through this massive data that's here to mow us all down. This one's even cooler. Graphic designers, data trolls, stats nerds, and in the middle, the very well-paid people. And I think, yes, our new epidemiologists can aspire to that. May not get there, but anyway, it's somewhere to aspire to. So, just a quick discussion of these three areas, but I think they actually are areas that do relate to the future for us as epidemiologists, and also the sorts of things that we need to be advocating for when we're working with government. And I think it is incredibly important that we actually think about whether or not we can empower people to own their own data. I think all of us would like the idea that we would have that control to opt in and opt out of research as we felt fit, as we saw fit. I personally am just so tired of talking to ethics committees about why do you need this variable, or all of this sort of fiddling around with data, wasting time, when there are other ways, which I think John also mentioned, of actually making sure that disclosure doesn't occur. And finally, this need to adapt our methods, try to get an understanding of the methods that the data scientists are using, and sort of end up on top in that area of intersection between the emerging disciplines of data trolls or data science and that of epidemiology. So, stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa. That many wonderful things to think about. We'll now hear from Leanne Parker with a New Zealand perspective on some of the underlying issues. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, John, for inviting me to speak today. Just thinking about linkages with a small l, I'm going to be talking about the use of national routinely collected health data and drug dispensing data for the purpose of studying medicine safety issues in New Zealand. And why I got kind of interested in this is that when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at fatal pulmonary embolism, and I did 2 national case control studies for that PhD. And one of them was looking at the relationship between various medicines and fatal pulmonary embolism. And I had to travel all around the country, around New Zealand, visiting general practices and hospitals to extract the data I needed from both paper records and electronic records. And although I'd worked in general practice for a few years, and I was at the time training as a public health medicine specialist as well, it was kind of interesting to be visiting all these places, but it actually took me about a year in total that I was away from home. And I sort of started to think there must be a better way. And of course at that time, the dispensing records in the pharmaceutical collection did not have NHIs attached, so this was the only way at the time. The other study I actually did, and I'm glad that you mentioned the DVT study, John, was actually fatal pulmonary embolism in relation to long-distance air travel. And again, I actually had to interview the relatives of people who died from fatal pulmonary embolism and find out whether they'd been on long-distance air travel, on long-distance flights before they'd died, and also the same with controls. So again, if I'd been able to use routinely collected linked data, my PhD would have taken me an awful lot less time, and it would have cost a lot less money as well. So anyway, I guess what I wanted to talk about was really just a quick bit of background. most of us hopefully know that when drugs first come on the market, and I mentioned this the other day in the show and tell session that Rod Jackson organised, but when drugs come on the market, we don't actually know very much about their long-term side effects, their rare side effects, what happens in pregnant women, what happens in people with lots of comorbidities, people who are taking lots of other drugs. And so we need some method, once drugs are on the market, to actually monitor their safety and find unintended harms and also unintended benefits sometimes as well. And so we need some way of doing this, and obviously linking data, dispensing data and health outcome data is a sensible way to go. Now at the moment in New Zealand, we can't just rely on the routinely collected data in the national collections that are held by the Ministry of Health in some studies, because we actually need additional information in order to confirm whether people actually had the outcome of interest or not. And so at the moment, it's not actually possible to get this information in a completely anonymous way. So in a couple of the studies I'll be talking about in a moment, we actually needed to send away to the hospitals to which people had been admitted to get further information like laboratory data or biopsy results and copies of hospital discharge letters. We also needed to get some information from coronial services as well. So that was the kind of information we needed. But what about the privacy aspects of that, and do we need consent? Now actually I've noticed throughout the day actually that people have been having problems with this clicker. That's not, and I realised that I'd actually skipped one slide inadvertently. So this was the brief that John gave me to talk about. So talk about some privacy considerations here in New Zealand, some successes and any difficulties accessing the data. Oops. So in terms of consent issues and consent to use medical information, you've seen this slide now because it's been up for a while, but sometimes it's not practicable to obtain individual consent just because of the sheer numbers involved, the elapsed time since the event, and some people have died, in which case you can't get consent. And also there's the scientific issues as well, that if we had to get consent, then the people that we ended up with in our studies would be systematically different from those who didn't give consent, and that would introduce bias. And also, sometimes having to seek consent can actually result in harm in some instances. Now, here in New Zealand, we are able to access information. The law and ethical guidelines do permit researchers to access personal health information about identifiable individuals without the consent of those individuals in certain circumstances and with certain safeguards. So when or just as I was actually finishing writing up my PhD, the MedSafe and the HRC, Health Research Council here in New Zealand, put out a request for proposals for feasibility studies to look at ways of improving pharmacovigilance in New Zealand. And so I and one of my former PhD supervisors, Charlotte Paul, and a statistician, Peter Herberson, and I put in a proposal. And what we decided to do was, although we were really convinced about the public good opportunities and the low risk of using existing health data to study the safety of drugs once they've been licensed for use in the general population, we actually wanted to know what the public thought about this and how the public actually weighed up the individual privacy and the public good arguments for such use. And so luckily we got the money, our application was successful, and we decided to organise a citizens' jury to explore this issue. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of a citizens' jury, I've put some of the key features up there. So basically you have randomly selected sort of, quote, ordinary citizens. They meet to deliberate on a particular question. They meet over several days. They hear from a range of expert witnesses, and they have the opportunity to actually question those expert witnesses and then to deliberate amongst themselves and make recommendations. And quite often, citizens' juries will also have sort of pre and post questionnaires about what people thought about the question before the citizens' jury began, and then what they thought about it afterwards. So the citizens' jury that we organised was held over 3 days, and we had a steering group which actually did a number of things. So it oversaw the framing of the question for the jury, also the selection of the expert witnesses and the selection of the jurors, the choice of venue and the timetable. And you can see here that we had sort of quite good representation on the steering committee. So the Office of the Health and Disability Commissioner is responsible for looking after the interests of health and disability consumers. Office of the Privacy Commissioner is obviously concerned with looking after the privacy rights of individuals. We had an epidemiologist and MedSafe. MedSafe is our medicine regulator here in New Zealand. They recommended who we should have for the expert witnesses, and you can see those there. We had a lawyer who was an expert in privacy law, an ethicist who was at the time a member of the National Ethics Advisory Committee, which was responsible for putting together various documents and policies about the ethics of observational studies, randomised controlled trials, and all of the things that people should be looking at when they're doing those forms of studies. We also had a medical pharmacoepidemiologist, we had a clinician who was a GP, and we had 2 consumer representatives. One who was known to be and was recommended by the advisory or the steering group, one who was known to be very supportive of research, and another who was known to be very, very worried about privacy issues with research. We had an independent chair as well, so Charlotte and I took no part at all in the actual running of the citizens' jury. The chair was a chair of an ethics committee. She was also a former television producer, and she kept everyone sort of trucking along, sort of, well, the speakers anyway, not the jury. She kept the speakers very much to time and made sure that the jury had the opportunity to ask as many questions as they wanted of the expert witnesses. And we also had a facilitator to work with the jury as well, and she was an experienced community worker. So this was, the idea of that was so that there weren't some sort of people that might dominate the jury over, some jury members over others. So that was what it involved, and on this slide you can see the question that was put to the jury. So, should researchers contracted by a public body be permitted to use medical information about identifiable people without their consent for the following purposes? So it distinguished between the purpose of monitoring drugs that had just been put on the market and drugs that had been on the market for quite a while, and there were emerging drug safety concerns about the drug. And so the jury was asked to decide what they thought about this question. They were asked to consider it on behalf of the whole of their community, not just their own individual view. They were told that it didn't need to be a unanimous decision. What we were interested in is what they decided and their reasons for deciding. And we also asked them if they said yes to either part or both of these questions, under what circumstances and with what safeguards, if any, and if they didn't agree with this for either part, with either activity, then we asked them to sort of tell us about their reasons for saying no. And they also had some explanatory notes. So we defined what we meant by a public body. So we, as you can see here, we were talking about the Health Research Council or MedSafe, and we also defined what we meant by medical information. So you can see here we had 2 different sorts of medical information. The health-related data collected by what was then called the New Zealand Health Information Service. So we did this jury back in 2008 for statistical and research purposes, but also health limited medical information that had been collected as part of that was recorded primarily for treatment purposes, so GP information, hospital discharge letters, and also death records as well. So the jury met for 3 days, and as you can see here, they unanimously concluded that both types of activities, so this is both monitoring drugs that are newly on the market and also investigating drug safety issues of concern in drugs that have been on the market for a while, should be permitted in specific circumstances and with particular safeguards, particularly following ethical guidelines, abiding by relevant laws, and taking measures to protect privacy. Now, one of the really interesting things about this whole process for Charlotte and I was that there was quite a shift in views from what people had said at the beginning of the process when they'd filled out their sort of individual questionnaires and what they had said at the end. And there was quite a shift in becoming far more comfortable with this use of the data. And people said that the reason that their views had shifted was actually having the opportunity to hear what safeguards were already in place, actually seeing what these data actually look like. I think some people had sort of imagined that it would be at the level of, really quite personal information, like, they were, I don't know, having an affair with somebody or whatever. And in fact, they saw that actually it was sort of quite often a series of numbers. So that was sort of greatly reassuring. And also seeing what the ethical guidelines were and actually seeing what an ethics application looked like. So they asked to see a blank application form. And so seeing all of that stuff, they said was very reassuring. So that was just the bit that I wanted to say about privacy. And so now I'm going to move on to the successes bit. So after before we'd quite finished that work, another request for proposals came out, which was for a 3-year project, again in pharmacovigilance and funded by MedSafe and HRC. And so we were part of a group that got some funding for that. And the bit that I was involved in of that project was actually, we plan to do 2 epidemiological studies using data from the national collections to investigate a drug safety issue and to see whether we could actually use these data and whether they'd be useful. So apologies to those of you who went to the show and tell session the other day. But the first of these studies was looking at simvastatin, which is a statin, a cholesterol-lowering drug, and the risk of rhabdomyolysis. So rhabdomyolysis in relation to the dose of simvastatin. Rhabdomyolysis, for those of you who don't know, is a condition where skeletal muscle breaks down. It can lead to acute renal failure and to death. And so what we did was a nested case control study. So it was a case control study nested within a cohort, as you can see, of over 300,000 people who had initiated use of simvastatin between the dates shown here. Thankfully, rhabdomyolysis is a very rare condition, so you can see there were very few cases, 29, and we confirmed the diagnosis using standard criteria with information that we extracted from hospital discharge letters and from death records. And we selected 10 controls per case, randomly selected them using risk set sampling, and we matched on age and sex. And just quickly, if any of you are interested in the results, which I didn't get to show the other day, we did find that people who were taking 40 milligrams of simvastatin per day were 5 times as likely to develop rhabdomyolysis as compared with those taking 20 milligrams a day. And you can see the absolute risks there as well, and thankfully they were reassuringly low. So that was the study. In terms of the relevance of it, really, I suppose it had both international and it provided useful information both at the national level and international level. Internationally, this was actually the first study in the world, or the biggest study rather, to look at the risk of serious muscle injury in a general population of simvastatin users. So all the trials were way too small because this is such a rare outcome. And so this was the biggest study that had been done, and it was also the first study to have provided separate estimates of risk for 40 milligrams and 20 milligrams of simvastatin per day. And this was actually very relevant to us here in New Zealand because at the time that we initiated this study, simvastatin was the first-line statin that was recommended for use for the prevention of cardiovascular events. And 40 milligrams was recommended for people at a reasonably high level of cardiovascular risk, and 20 milligrams was recommended for people at a slightly lower risk than that. So it was quite relevant information clinically. So the next study, again, I mentioned this the other day, and those of you who went to one of the record linkage sessions the other day would have seen Mei Ling Blank present this study in a bit more detail. But again, this was a study using a nested case control design. It was looking at the relationship between proton pump inhibitors and interstitial nephritis, acute interstitial nephritis, an inflammatory condition in the kidneys. very similar methods to the simvastatin study. 46 cases of interstitial nephritis confirmed by hospital discharge records and renal biopsy. There were no deaths in the study. Again, controls selected by risk sex sampling and matched on age and sex. And you can see the results here. So people who were current users of PPIs on the index data and the case control analysis were 5 times as likely to have developed acute interstitial nephritis as compared with people who were in the cohort of people who'd started proton pump inhibitors but then had stopped taking them. And again, you can see the incidence rates here are low. So this also produced some useful information for us. Internationally, it was actually the first study to confirm the previously suspected relationship between proton pump inhibitors and acute interstitial nephritis. So there'd been lots of case reports and case series, but there'd actually been no formal analytical studies to actually investigate this at the time the study was initiated. And it was also really relevant here at a national level, just simply because it really highlighted the incredibly widespread use of proton pump inhibitors. So you can see here that about 30% of New Zealanders of all aged 60 years and above had been prescribed a PPI at least once during this study period. We can also see that there was prescribing to infants as well, so 4% of New Zealand infants per year. And PPIs are not licensed for use in infants, so this was something that we'll look into further. So those were some examples of things that we've done which we think were quite useful things to do. So now I'm going to finally come to the final bit, which is the data access. And I guess this is, and to use Frank's terms, a bespoke data linkage thing. So this is just outlining the steps really of the simvastatin study, and the steps that are highlighted in lilac are the sort of the data access steps. And so the first one is us applying for ethical approval. So we applied, and then 1.5 months later, our study was approved. So that was very good. We then sent a data request to Analytical Services. So that was now what used to be called the New Zealand Health Information Service, had changed their name to Analytical Services, and they also, Analytical Services, then sent a request to Pharmac for their approval for the release of the data. So from the time that we first submitted our request to the time we got the data was 4.5 months, and then the other sort of data access point was actually us sending NHIs, which we had for the potential cases, we didn't have them for, didn't have NHIs for anyone else, to the hospitals to which potential cases had been admitted, to ask them for copies of discharge letters and other diagnostic information. And it took, and we also requested data from Coronial Services as well. And you can see there that it took 5.5 months to get those data. So I guess what I'm hoping, so going from my PhD when I actually had to go out and go into basements and attics and actually get information out of paper records and look at electronic GP records, from that to using these data sets, what I'm hoping that we can move to next really is that rather than having to sort of go to hospitals and get information about laboratory results, etc., that actually that information is going to be available electronically as well. And then, I mean, the advantages of that are not only the sort of the time thing, as you can see here, but also then we won't actually need to get these potential identifiers, the NHI. Although we don't have access to the NHI database, so we can't actually look up and see the names and addresses of these people. NHIs are still potential identifiers. But if we could get all of this information to validate the diagnoses of the conditions we're interested in electronically without having to have the NHIs, then that would obviously be preferable in terms of privacy. And I think also if we had linked and it'll be really interesting to hear what Graham Osborne is going to be talking about. But you know, if we have linked data where we can actually get all of this stuff in a lot more of a timely fashion rather than doing these bespoke linkages, that would be fabulous as well. So I'll just leave it there for now.
I mentioned before that the government, the two tiers of government in Australia has made national record linkage difficult. But because the Australian government has moved to recognise the importance of big data, some months ago they appointed a new Deputy Secretary in the Commonwealth Department of Health to be responsible for data, and we've had a little bit of communication with Paul Madden, who's in that position, and we hoped he would be able to come and join the session today, but he wasn't able to come, but he has provided a video, so that will give, I think, a perspective on where the Australian government at Commonwealth Health Department is moving. After that video, we'll ask Graham Osborne to come and speak to us about the New Zealand government position, and then we'll get all the panel members to come up and we'll take questions both from the floor and from each other. So if we could have the video now, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Madden. I'm a Deputy Secretary with the Department of Health here in Australia. Thanks very much for the invitation to your conference. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to travel to New Zealand to be there in person. And if you're watching this video, it means we also weren't able to get an interactive electronic video working between Australia and New Zealand for this event. But either way, I'm hoping that the conference has been going very well so far. I'm going to take you through some of the things happening in the Department of Health here in Australia around data governance and information management. A little bit of history on where we've come from here. We have come from a distributed arrangement where each of the divisions are in charge of all of the data, its access, its acquisition, and how it's managed and governed. That's where it's been. All of that is destined to change because we're going to adopt an enterprise approach across the department to data access, data management, data governance, and data release policies, which will no doubt have some impact on the health research communities. The enterprise approach has been developed over the last probably 1 to 2 years, and it's been drawn down from the high-level principles that manage all of our data. They've been agreed to by the organisation and now in place across each of the divisions, a single set of principles to guide everything. The Data Information and Governance Framework has been created, signed off and adopted across the divisions as well. So the way that we value, the way that we store, the way that we access, the way that we manage the access to it and record all of those things is all a common approach now. We have a single data model which has been created over time. It's there as a single model to show everything that we have, but we continue to work on that to add further information around metadata so that we're actually able to make better use of that in a deeper way across the organisation when we start to bring data sets together. We've now got a single data repository, data warehouse that services the whole department and some of the agencies who are part of the health portfolio, and that gives us a single version of the truth. We have a single way of loading information into that warehouse. We've got a single access regime for all of our staff who get access to it. And they've all got access to state-of-the-art modelling and analysis tools so that they can take a step above doing some of the reporting processes which give us some good linear information to a place where they can start doing some predictive modelling. They can start to join data sets together where that's in line with our legal requirements. To build models of the state of the current health system and start to draw out some predictions on where that might go across the next couple of years and decades. Skills and centres of practice are an issue for us in distributed data and distributed ways of dealing with that across the organisation in the years in the past. They've all grown up to different levels using different tools and different techniques. We've created a centre of excellence which brings all of the people involved in the data management, data analysis and the data reporting, so that they're all lifting their skills up to the same level and making the best and the most use of the tools that we've provided to them. The data governance arrangements have been drawn out at an enterprise level so that people can get a predicted performance around what we should get from data governance and the way that our data is managed. It's supportive of multiple users of the data. As I said before, we do have what we call a single version of truth for all of our data in the enterprise data warehouse. And we're treating that data as a shared asset for the organisation on the basis it can be used to shape the health system as we step forward. All of our data governance arrangements are faithful to any of the access and purpose agreements that relate to that data. For example, medical benefits information and the pharmaceutical benefits information have specific laws that don't allow us to draw that together except for very, very special circumstances. So our data governance arrangements need to be absolutely faithful to any legislation, any regulations and any policies that are in place. We've put in place performance metrics and asset valuation processes for our data. We need to know what we're using our data for. We need to know things about the integrity and the quality level of that data and that information. But we also need to know the value of it, because every year we're tempted to introduce new data to our holdings, and at some point we need to make decisions about which data we either stop collecting or we don't support, on the basis of making the best value of those assets. So that is based on a cost and benefit analysis for new data coming into the system. The data access and release policy is one of the things which has been drawn out of the data governance arrangements for the department. Where we've moved to for data access and release is we want one arrangement across the whole department. So each of the divisions are still in charge of, they're the stewards and they're accountable for access and release to the data. But the way in which they undertake their analysis and make recommendations on whether data should or shouldn't be released should all be based on a common rule set. That way people who are outside of the organisation trying to get access to information that we hold can actually understand how the system does work and what they might actually get access to. One of the key principles in the data access release policies is that any data that can be made public should be made public. That means we're not kind of waiting for everybody to request everything. If things can be made public and they're available to researchers without needing to request, then they can get on and figure out what can be done with that information which is publicly available before they start asking for more. And their requests for further information can possibly be more targeted. We'll also provide controlled environments for information and data which is probably more restricted because it either carries personal or private information or produces some kind of security risk or privacy risk if it's released into the public environment. We need to provide that controlled environment for researchers and others to come into a safe place where we can actually manage and monitor what's being accessed and be able to report that to the Privacy Commissioner if that's needed. We want to provide as much access as possible, but we need to minimise risks. We need to remember that the information we have around performance of our health system generally all relate to interventions that individuals have had with the health system. And with that comes private information and personal information. And we are able to take steps with some of that data to de-identify, confidentialise, or even take particular elements of that data away so that we reduce the risk of providing any private or personal information, or for that to be re-identified, or providing controlled environments in which people can see that and do the research they need to without providing a risk. Identified data still has its owners. The same rules will apply. Whole data sets is an issue for us. Whole data sets that contain private or personal information can often be re-identified, even if we do take steps to take some of that private or personal information out. But parts of that data set can probably be made more available. And I think what we do need to do is question what can be provided as opposed to the whole data set. The whole data set may not be available, but it may be possible by taking certain elements out that we can provide that with either a low risk or no risk at all. The final point around our data access and release policies is that we will completely acknowledge precedents in decisions that have already been made. I've seen many cases where the same data is requested by the same party of the same division, and it takes some time for people to analyse and understand their own local governance policies before they make a decision or a recommendation to release or not release that data. On the basis we have established a precedent, we need to acknowledge that precedent so we can make those decisions a lot faster and get on with the business of working with the data. The next steps for data access and release, I've still got one sign-off to obtain. We've had sign-off through all levels of the organisation. Final sign-off I'm expecting possibly by the time this conference is live or shortly thereafter. The first step after sign-off, we'll start to create a catalogue of data which is accessible publicly. And that could be data that we will make publicly available from the Department of Health, or data that we are the custodian of and make it publicly available through the Department of Human Services. We'll also have a catalogue of data which is not publicly available, again to assist researchers and others when they're making requests for data to target exactly what it is they need to satisfy their research request, rather than asking for whole data sets, which, as I mentioned before, can be quite sensitive or carry significant risks with it. We're looking to create a catalogue of precedent decisions, and that will carry who's the requester, what was the purpose, what was the data set and what was the decision, and that can translate directly to the same requester asking for the same data in a different time series, or it could relate to another requester asking for the same data for the same purpose, and that'll actually help us speed up the approval or the resolution process behind that. We'll introduce a concept, I call it a single front door. It doesn't mean you have to push all of your requests for data access into the same place, but wherever they land in the department, we'll be recording the fact that we've got a request for data, and we'll be timing how long it takes us to satisfy that request. We need to make sure that the performance that you can expect from the system is predictable. We'll be coming up with some measures that people should be able to understand or expect how long it might take from a request before it's either answered in a positive or a negative form, and how long it might be before you get access to that data. In the longer term, we still have some ways to go in the Department of Health to get a common approach actually working on the ground across all of the divisions. But beyond there, we've already started conversations with other departments, particularly around the health and welfare portfolios, where we do have some common elements of data, and certainly from your own perspectives as researchers, you'd be approaching multiple agencies for access to this information. So we'd like to get to the stage we have a common process which is working across those agencies. Again, it makes it more predictable and more likely that you will get satisfied in terms of the requests you're putting through. We'd also in that process be looking to share knowledge of requests for data across agencies. Again, what we don't want is to what we do want is to make sure that if you do request the same information from multiple agencies, that you actually get the same answer as a result of that request, as opposed to one that says one's taking a long time, another might happen a lot quicker. Data linking, another extension beyond the data access and release policies. Most of you would probably be aware that we have a governance arrangement for data linking here in Australia, which is where we have an organisation which is reliant on linking one or more data sets which are owned or provided by a Commonwealth agency. The governance arrangement for that have been fairly well documented. Our experience with this is kind of narrow at this stage, but we do have several accredited data linking agencies at the moment. Two that come to mind is the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and the other one is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Both of those are accredited to be able to link data sets across agencies on the basis of supporting research in the community. Expected outcomes from the new processes. You should be able to expect more timely decisions on data access requests. You probably won't get any more data than you used to get, but I'm expecting you might get it a whole lot faster. We'll have efficient approval, extraction and release processes on the basis that we're able to provide it to you in a place where you can keep it safely and do that research, and then follow the any rules that might exist around its future destruction or its safekeeping and access by people who are part of your organisation. Process should be a whole lot more reliable, and it should continue to protect the privacy of individuals to whom all of this data relates. That's really all I had to say. Again, I hope that gives some insights as to what we're doing here in Australia at the Department of Health to manage our data in a more enterprise approach. And I hope that the benefits that these steps bring to you will be seen in the near future. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for your time.
I think there were many positive things in that expression from Paul, but the symbolic thing is that the department has realised it's got to move and appointed a senior person, and a lot of unanswered questions as well from a research perspective. But I'd like to ask Graham Osborne now to speak, and he may choose to speak officially on behalf of the New Zealand government, or perhaps
Hi everybody, thanks for giving me the chance to talk with you. I'm still reflecting on my colleague from Australia, and I'm just thinking about that question you asked, John. So let me start by saying that firstly, I'm a mathematician, and in fact I spent 6 years at Statistics New Zealand as a senior executive working for a gentleman called Brian Pink, who went on to be the government statistician in Australia. So the second point I want to say is, and I guess I didn't quite hear it in the discussion Paul put forward, I'm not convinced we're collecting very good data in our health system right now. And therefore, if we think of the why question, why are we even doing this? The challenge we've got is in the Western world, our health systems aren't actually sustainable anymore. And in fact, the biggest barrier we've got is the creation of knowledge and ensuring that knowledge gets into the right hands, disseminated out and executed well, so that we continue to have an adaptive, flexible health system. And that's got to be consumer-led, it's got to have clinicians as co-designers and co-producers, and it's got to have wonderful people like yourselves who are creating the research for that knowledge to be created and ultimately implemented. So I think the reason I got invited here, possibly, other than the fact that I have a role in the ministry, is that a gentleman called Tony Blakely and I put our heads together a few months ago and said, you know, if we're really going to make a difference, we're going to have to create a community of researchers who actually want to create a different way of operating. And instead of being on the outside, knocking on the door and asking for information, they need to actually be at the table and helping us to design the solutions we're trying to put in place. So I guess I'm going to take a slightly different angle today, and then I'm going to enjoy some questions from you all for the panel members. But the role that I have is interesting. For the first time in New Zealand, we have a senior executive in the ministry who's responsible for setting strategy around the collection of information. That's working through a group called the National Health IT Board. And then my role is also to manage the collections that are inside the ministry, which is now in the information group rather than NZHIS. It takes a long time for these brands to disappear, doesn't it? But that's all right. I'm happy to say the information group and the people who work in it are very happy to pick up that role. And so the question that I might want you to think about is, so why do we think the IT board is going to do a good job in collecting a different set of information that is going to be useful not just for research purposes, but for a real-time, big data, much more adaptable health system? And the reason is that everything we do is based on quality outcomes. So we've absolutely inherited the Health Quality and Safety Commission's view that the triple aim is the goal, and everything we do, we focus on the quality outcome of the individual and the clinicians who work with that individual, and therefore we're thinking about the safety, the efficacy of the interventions, and the efficiencies ultimately that get driven out of a quality model. So there are three things that I think I was asked to talk about. One is privacy. So how do we manage privacy in that world? Well, I think the example given about the jury earlier in earlier presentations is excellent. Let's go out and talk to consumers and find out where their tolerances are for understanding how their information will be used for the betterment of the health system and for society. So in fact, we're doing a lot of work in putting together governance models that will enable consumers to see that the information that is used is going to be used safely and that the outcomes are going to be valuable and built back into the way the health system operates. So a couple of examples of that. We strongly support the IDI, which is the Integrated Data Integration Service that is getting put together by Stats New Zealand. And in fact, the Ministry of Health has been putting information into that that's starting to enable the first set of linked projects that includes health information. We've worked with NIHI at Auckland University as a centre of excellence around cardiology information, and we have contracted them to behave as an agent of the Ministry of Health in this sense, or on behalf of the health sector, so that they become the expert group working with researchers who are interested in getting access to cardiology information and heart health information. So on the co-production side, Tony and I put a bit of a plan together, and we got a group of researchers in a room about a month ago, and we said, how would you like to work and what would work for you? And I think they were a little bit shocked in that first meeting, Tony, but they're coming around. They said they'd have a second meeting with us, so that was good. I took that as a positive. The question we asked them may not have been the question in your minds. The question we asked them is, the IT board's now getting some investments in place that is enabling us to have real-time information, and let's use examples, medicine information. So by December this year, we will have real-time information for every community prescription that is prescribed by a GP and completed by a pharmacist. So having that real-time information at our fingertips, what are we going to do with it? Who's going to work with it? What are the projects we want to follow up with? What do you think Pharmac might like to know about that? What would clinicians like to know? What would MedSafe like to know? And I think the options are endless. So what I want to make sure that as we get high quality information collated in a big data sort of construct, we're also already thinking in parallel about how we're going to use that data and add value to it. So I'm going to finish with just one other idea to extend the big data construct. So what happens next? Well, we know kind of what happens next. We're going further and further into biological science to the point where genomics, proteomics, lately a lot of research starting to go into the biome. These are real personal biological aspects of individuals and how they live and their decisions they make, and all of that information, including that Fitbit information that's coming off there every day to make sure they do 10,000 steps, all of that's going to end up somewhere. And ending up somewhere, we're going to have to be very smart about how we manage that and make that available. So I'm going to finish by saying we're going to try and cut our teeth on pharmaceutical information because it's a known product that we understand, but we are very mindful that we want to be creating the sort of data sets that will enable us to see a lot more further into the future. Thank you.
We'll pull the panel together now, so maybe if Graham and Frank, if you'd like to make some introductory remarks on what you've heard, giving us an international perspective, that'd be great.
I think probably people have heard enough from me, actually. It's been a privilege to be here for the last couple of days, and if I can answer any of the questions, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you so much. And can we invite questions from the floor and also questions from panel members to each other?
It's less a question but more a comment, and I have to say that having heard Paul Madden and Graham Osborne, I'm really, really pleased and feel very privileged that I am a researcher in New Zealand. I felt that this, I mean, I'm glad he's not here
think a number of people, some of whom are in the room, who've waited months, years for even responses from our Commonwealth Department of Health about data access. If Paul Madden is able to at least improve the response time, then we'll be far further ahead in Australia than we have been. But I also share your thought that because New Zealand is small and it's only got one level of government, and it's I mean, the other complicating thing in Australia is with two levels of government, the tradition, the competition between governments, it's a sort of trade-off of information versus money, and I think you have that to a lesser extent in New Zealand. So, yeah, there's a cultural difference, and I hope we can learn from New Zealand.
Catherine Bennett here. I actually sat on the academic advisory group for the Victorian government when they were looking at building, I guess, a more sophisticated data linkage system. And the good thing about that, following up on your comments, Brad, from your own working group experience, was that there was a real recognition that researchers had to understand data custodians just as much as data custodians did to understand the potential of research. And actually getting us around the table and working together, even in that working group at the start, but more had to be done to get that two-way interaction so that the data systems themselves could get better and be set up in a way that gave government and policymakers the intelligence they wanted via partnership with researchers. So I guess that's the key thing also that I heard in your presentation, Graham, and I think is critical for us to really move this ahead rather than just trying to make the most of, as you yourself said, partially flawed or not the best quality healthcare.
Can I pick up on that? Look, maybe it's because of my statistical background, but when I came into the Ministry of Health around 5 years ago, I was surprised, I guess, by the national collections. They are very good collections and their quality is outstanding. I mean, the people in there are amazing. However, it's what I call activity data. It's a series of transactional sets of data that actually were collected for financial and administrative purposes that have a code attached to them. I'm being a little bit facetious, but and it became very clear to me that they weren't really understanding the way the clinicians were working, the way the consumers were engaging, and the real outcomes that were being driven. But in a more real-time world, they can all be byproducts of understanding the workflow. And so the IT board's gone back and done a huge amount of work at the coalface to ensure that we actually collect personal information that tracks the patient's journey and gives a much richer data set that then can be used for those same reasons, for administrative reasons and for research purposes. As a byproduct, you actually create an opportunity for really interesting funding models to come off that. So we really have flipped the model on its head. And I think a question that people need to think about is, why are we collecting all this data for financial reasons to count how many of everything? Why aren't we saying we want a really smart health system and we want to collect data for that reason? The money can come secondary.
Yes, I think we all agree with that. Australia has tried to introduce an e-health record recently, but the uptake has been quite poor. And
would you like me to make an observation?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry to have to tell you, but we think you got it wrong.
Yeah.
We came up with a very similar strategy back 5 years ago, and in fact, if people are aware, we launched a plan almost 4 years ago to the day, and we said we would not create a electronic health record for every New Zealander in Wellington, because we didn't think that was the right model. So what we've created is a record we call a patient portal that GPs offer, and we currently have 40,000 New Zealanders with those as active records. And they are coming to Auckland one day, but the Auckland GPs are just a little slow off the mark. But the exciting thing about that is they're a service extension to general practice. So the GP's offering it to well people who have got episodic care requirements, because generally people are well. And in fact, looking at your electronic health record is really boring when you're well. But for those people who are at risk, who are or are elderly and they have multiple drugs and comorbidities, all of a sudden being able to visualise just the primary healthcare record is a huge step forward, especially if they can all see their lab results and their discharge summaries from hospital as well. So we've gone down the strategy that says, look, if we can get that part of it right, we've got a few other things we're doing in the background. And what that means is you create a hybrid model. So you don't try and do it in one system, you don't try and do it coming out of Wellington or Canberra, because in fact New Zealanders and Australians don't want the government providing that service. You actually build it into the way they touch the health system, and it becomes a value-added service. But over time, you make sure all the data is coherent, and you make sure the data can be accessed and made available for other uses. So that's our strategy. It's a you might say a hybrid strategy. We call it a middle-out strategy. Let's capture the information at the time of care so that we understand it, and then let's build it together over time. It's a challenging, much more difficult strategy, but one that over the long term we think will be more valuable and that will be valued both by consumers and clinicians.
Frank?
I was just going to add that I think that will be driven by consumers as well, that kind of process. It doesn't matter what clinicians, epidemiologists or politicians think. I think the consumers will drive that process across the world.
Yes.
Just a couple of comments really, just to follow up on a couple of things that Louise has said. I really, appreciate your comments about we need to have systems so we're not too bogged down as researchers in going through the process of what variables we're allowed to have and what we're not, and getting bogged down with that. I agree we need to streamline that process and have the onus on the researchers to be doing the right thing with the data. But as a data custodian wearing my hat as a director of the Cancer Registry, the quality of a lot of the applications we get, and I'm sure no one in this room would do it, but a lot of them have, you're left thinking, could these people sit the right way in a chair? And so, you're really left with a lot of concern about the capacity of some users, if they're given the data, to actually manage it well. And so that comes to your point about training. And I absolutely agree that we need to develop better and accessible training resources, be they the sort of idiot's guide or the really sophisticated guide, depending on people's needs. And we need some way to really expedite that, because the sort of complexity and availability of data is probably going at a greater rate than our training and capacity building for expertise. So I'll be really interested in your comments on how we do that effectively without reinventing the wheel of good resources that might be available internationally or in this sort of space.
Good question. I mean, possibly the Biostatistics Collaboration of Australia type model could be something that we might think about. People who don't know about that, I'm not sure if Annette's here, Annette Dobson.
She was.
She was.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact number of universities that are involved, but it's 5 or 6 different universities across Australia basically offer units as part of a degree course in biostatistics. So the students enrol in one of the universities, but they take the units from any of the universities. I think in a fairly small specialised area like biostatistics, that's worked well in terms of providing really high quality training, but it's also sort of created a community. The biostatisticians who are providing that training across the institutions actually collaborate in ways they would not otherwise through running that course. And I think it has created a community of biostatisticians, of whom there's quite a few here. Put up your hands, I can see several of them, who've actually gone through that program. So that could be a model we could think about.
Yes, the other way is to link the approvals process to funding, for example, through NHMRC or other agencies. In other words, if a project's judged to be worthwhile funding, then it should solve the problems you're alluding to. I mean, yeah.
Maybe.
Can I, oh, sorry, Rod. Can I just say something? It's not in relation to cancer, but a group of us have been thinking about this in relation to drug safety studies, excuse me. And we, in June, had someone, Tara Gomes, out from the Ontario Drug Policy Research Network, in Toronto, or in Ontario, and we kind of like the sort of model that they've got, and we've sort of been giving some thoughts to how we could do that here in New Zealand, which would be to sort of have a network that had a sort of core scientific group or academic group, or whatever you want to call it. And so if clinicians or others are interested in doing drug safety research, there'd be sort of some hub to which sort of people could come and discuss ideas and sort of develop a research project and sort of make sure that the sort of biostatistical and the epidemiological things are all of good quality, and then sort of have that collaboration really. Because I think that's the danger of having all of these data and being able to link them and making them more accessible. We don't want to do it badly and get the wrong answers out there and cause confusion and lack of trust. Yeah.
But do you think there's a single version of the truth? I was very, I was very dismayed by that statement by Paul Madden, but anyway.
Yeah.
So I just want to, I need to challenge a bit about the training, and maybe to endorse what you said, John, is just there's some really bad applications out there. You always going to get bad research proposals. But as you said, there's an NHMRC process, we have an HR. There's multiple processes already available, multiple structures that are designed to separate out the good from the bad research proposals. Let's use those. Let's not create any more training. I mean, we've got universities, we've got programs, but let's actually put them through our current sort of, SIVs to identify good projects, and then they should go to a cancer society, etc. We don't want to create any more training. I mean, the training you get as an epidemiologist dealing with small data are the essential skills you need for dealing with big data. So I think we've got most of the skills that we need. In fact, those small data skills are really important, because one of the biggest problems when you get big data, people think, I don't need to worry about bias or anything, because this data will solve all my problems. You just get more precisely confounded results, don't you?
I don't agree with you. I think most epidemiologists have extremely low levels of competency in areas of computer science, data security, any of those things. They're not formally taught that. I would love to have a course I could send my PhD students to that covered some of those things. And with regards to NHMRC being the sort of way to winnow out the projects, what's the success rate? 14%? It's only the minority of research that happens that's actually getting funded through those sorts of mechanisms.
But, if an NHMRC or the New Zealand MRC had a special group that kind of gave the tick to projects requiring linkage, then, as you know, the projects often get passed on and get funded through another channel if they don't get up. Yeah.
I think if they get funded that way, that's a tick, but it doesn't mean other things. There's going to be a lot of other research that doesn't get funded that way. Yeah.
Just working on hoping the microphone's working. My voice is fading. I've been talking too much the last few days, even by my standards. Is this working? No. Okay. Look, I just want to follow up on what Graham said, and I want to say 4 things and invite comments from you to me by email, which is always a risk because it makes more work for me. Vision. I want to hear from people in the epidemiological community about what vision they would have 5 to 10 years from now about the way that we can use routine or appended data in New Zealand to improve the quality of our research. That's the first question. I'm going to get the microphone as I get to number 4. Second, in my experience, being involved with this type of data, is that it's wrong just to build the data without thinking about the research questions we're going to ask. So I want to hear from people about really big research questions that we could answer in the next 5 to 10 years with better quality data that would excite politicians and funders. That's my second point. The third thing I want to hear about is how people feel about bespoke versus one system. And what Leanne just described was about halfway in between. We have a community of interest, say around pharmacoepidemiology or vigilance, and there might be several communities of interest. Are we at the point in a country like New Zealand we want to move to one system of linkage and some concentration of analysis and knowledge about the data and people who are curating the data, or do we still want to be the way we are now, where Rod grabs his data, I grab our data, and we're a decentralised way of dealing with information added to data? And the fourth thing I want to hear about from people is how this might be resourced, particularly if we're prepared to move down the Scottish line, for example, to a big centre. I don't just mean dollars, I mean people. This is the huge capacity issue here. I mean institutions. Do we have one university driving it? Do we have several universities coming together? Should the DHBs be part of it? Ideas about how one would configure something to meet that vision. So those are the four things I'm putting out there. Email me with them. We have a window of opportunity at the moment, the next 6 months, for this type of discussion. There is no plan in place at the moment, but ideas coming in would be very useful. So those four things. What's your vision? What are the big research questions that could excite funders, politicians, to help get some resourcing? Do you want bespoke as we are now, or moving to one centre, or perhaps regional, sort of a regionalised one that Leanne was describing? And then how do you want to do it, both people, institutions and resources? Kia ora.
Thank
my
you
email,
very
just
much.
Google me.
It's now just after 5 when we're scheduled to finish. Are there any urgent comments or questions from the panel and the floor?
Can I just make a comment? As I think all my veterinary group left, unfortunately. But one thing to encourage, first of all, is you've got no idea about having to manage data and when you have to actually get it from every other industry and they don't talk to each other and they don't connect. So I understand some of your concerns, but in the veterinary world it can be a lot worse. The one thing that I really liked what was the challenge put out just before, and I was thinking some of the same stuff. What Graham touched on about having a vision. What type of information do you really need? And recently, if you saw Nigel's talk about the fact that a lot of the risk in the infectious side are all newly emerging things. So what are you going to do to be able to find those quickly, and what sort of surveillance systems are you going to have? And the flexibility of your system to be able to adapt to new questions, that research question, I think is really important. And I would like to see, we talk about One Health, but actually some of the indicators may be in our data sets. And we probably need to learn a bit from you, but also being able to amalgamate some of the animal health data sets with your own may be better indicators in some of the situations that you're trying to look at. So I think there's some new challenges there, but certainly looking at that adaptability and thinking about what sort of information you want in the future, I think that's really important.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'd like Leanne. Yes.
Can I just say one really quick thing in terms of training? A group of us have invited Professor Alan Brookhart over from the University of North Carolina. He's coming down to Dunedin in late November to run a workshop on pharmacoepidemiology methods. But he's doing a lot of stuff on using routinely collected data and methods to deal with confounding, like propensity scores and instrumental variables and various other things that will apply not just to pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety research. So there's some flyers around if anyone's interested. Sorry.
Thank you. I just, on behalf of everyone, like to thank the panel very much for getting the ideas circulating. We haven't got a solution that's ideal for Australia. You seem far more advanced in New Zealand, but I'd also just like to thank Alistair Woodward, who really, I think, helped to put this session together. And I think the fact that the questions are still unresolved in many respects is a challenge, and we've heard how to take things forward. But I think Robert Scragg would just like to say a few words to wind up the meeting. Yeah.
In fact, there'll be two very brief, quick words. I'll let Linda sort of have the last word. Just a couple of things first. One is our last award. So this is the People's Choice of the Best Poster Award, and the award is to Shoaib Hassan. Is Shoaib here at all? No? Okay, we'll make sure he will get his certificate. And also Alistair and Tony, you don't know this yet, but Alistair and Tony have kindly going to give him a signed copy of their book. Have you got your pen there, Tony? A Healthy Country, A History of Life and Death in New Zealand. And Shoaib's poster was actually Epidemiological Response Capacity in the Western Pacific Region, Need of a Regional Solution. So, lastly, oh yes, housekeeping, note to self. Posters out there, please remember to take them with you. You put them up so long ago, you've probably forgotten that they are there. And the other thing is we're keen to get feedback on this meeting. And so the conference organisers are going to set up a survey monkey questionnaire next week. And I believe you will receive an email, everybody who's registered for the conference. So we would very much like your feedback, and we will incorporate your responses in the report that we give to the AEA Council on this meeting. Lastly, I just want to give my thanks. I want to thank you all for coming here. And particularly I want to thank the speakers. Some of them have left already, but Frank, I particularly want to thank you. Where are you? All right, okay. Well, I'm sure he's going to sleep like a baby on the way back to Toronto because we really have worn him out, I believe. And I will certainly send him my thanks after this meeting. I think he's really made a critical input to this meeting. I know I've actually spoken to some of the key players here, certainly in New Zealand, and they've been quite inspired by what he's set up there in Scotland and also is hoping to do in Toronto. And lastly, thanks. I just want to thank the committee, our conference committee, for this organising this meeting. And they're all listed there in the handbook. I particularly want to thank three people on the committee. Alistair, who I think had responsibility for the program, and I think it's been a really great program. So thank you, Alistair. Also, Rod Jackson for sponsorship. He was a true shoe leather epidemiologist going and knocking on doors. So thank you, Rod, for that. And lastly, Christy Carter for always being there on the phone every 2 weeks on our teleconferences and regularly asking very insightful questions about what was happening. So thank you, Christy. Thank you to all of those people. And very lastly, I'd like to thank our conference organisers, Rachel Cook and also Rachel Speedy, who put a lot into the organisation of this meeting. So thank you both.
I'd just like to, on behalf of everybody attending, thank Robert and his team for organising a wonderful conference. I think there's two things that make a wonderful conference: creating an environment where you just love to get together with people that share your vision and interest, and a conference where you can get stimulated and think, gee, I want to go back and actually do some work. So congratulations to you and the team. It's been fabulous. Thanks very much. I think there's going to be a few people who have some good sleep tonight, actually, but hopefully a little bit of catching up before that for many of us. So I'd just like to congratulate, as I said, all of the people for organising a conference, everybody involved in that. I'd like to thank all of you for coming along. What makes AEA strong is its members, so it's really important that we attend and participate. So please encourage your colleagues to join and be part of this all. That's really important. I just want to advertise the Population Health Congress next year. I think we've got 2 slides, so there's a little bit of detail about it, and a picture of Hobart as well, perhaps. There you go. So hopefully we can all get together again. There isn't an AEA conference next year, it is the Congress, so that's where we get together, and we have to make sure we have an input in abstracts and so on to make all of that happen. Just a reminder about the IEA bid as well that Tony is leading for us to bring the IEA bid to Melbourne. I hope that you all encourage people to join the IEA. And I'd just like to wish everyone well and thank all the members for actively participating. I think New Zealand have some amazing epidemiologists here and amazing work, and it's been wonderful to have the conference here. So thank you very much.